Okay guys, want to make a quick video on measuring your pistons. I've already measured all these, but I'll show you one. So you're gonna want to get the correct size micrometer. This is a 2 to 3 inch. So just depending on whatever bore your pistons are, you get one that's close. And then almost all aftermarket pistons are going to come with instructions on how to measure. These are JE pistons from RPG. So they tell you where to measure. You can see right there you're basically 500 thousandths of an inch up from the bottom of the skirt. This is pretty simple stuff. But either way, I'll show you. What I did was I measured and I drew lines with a Sharpie on the skirt. Let's see if I can see a little Sharpie mark. So after I measured, or I'm sorry, after I drew those marks, you know, I took several measurements. Actually, it wasn't this micrometer I did with this. It was a 3 to 4. These are like 3.7. 3.701, I believe, is the bore for a Predator. So anyway, then you're gonna take your micrometer. You know, I had this sitting on a table, you know, and I took basically 2 or 3 measurements just to make sure I'm getting repeated measurements. And then once you have all those, you know, you just write them down. Which I ended up taking a bunch on one of them, but let's see. So here, I wrote down, you know, it was multiple times, but I wrote down measurements and I numbered the bags. Yeah, so this was piston number 2. So that's how you measure your pistons. They're all extremely close. Again, most aftermarket pistons are going to be, you know, they should be close. If they're not, then you might have problems. What I'm going to do, this same video, since it's piston related, I'm going to wipe down the cylinders one more time on the block, so make sure you have a really clean surface. And then I'm going to set my dial bore gauge for that bore, and I'll zero it on a micrometer to a set number. I'll tell you what I end up setting it to. And then I'm going to measure. I'll take 6 measurements per bore or per cylinder, 3 different heights, and then I'll do basically 90 degrees from where I take the first measurements. So I'm going to do, you know, top, middle, bottom, you know, on one plane, and then I'll rotate 90 degrees and I'll take 3 more measurements, top, middle, bottom, and you're basically checking for any taper of the cylinder and any out of round. And then I'll notate those measurements on a piece of paper, and then based on what I get from that, that's how I'm going to decide what piston, which again I numbered the bags, you know, which piston will basically go in which cylinder. So that's what I'm doing today, and then I'm going to try and do a separate video on no, it might be today. I need to torque down my connecting rod, the caps on my rods, and then measure the bolt stretch, and I'll show you how to do that. And then I'll have to write down all those numbers so I know exactly how much torque to yield the amount of stretch that ARP wants for rod bolt stretch. Okay, so I got my dial bore gauge zeroed to 3.700. On paper, these are, you know, this bore's 94 millimeter, or just 3.70 bore. So what I'm going to do, this is 5, 6, 7, 8, but it doesn't matter which order you do them in. So I'm basically gonna stick this in, take a measurement, you know, at basically the top third section, and then in the middle, and then the bottom third, and then I'm going to rotate it 90 degrees, do the same thing. So that's 6 measurements. I got a piece of paper and a pen, so I'm going to write down all my measurements as I take them. All right, so I got those 3 measurements. Now I'm going to rotate 90 degrees and do the same thing. All right, I wrote this under cylinder 1, which I'm an idiot. I'm measuring cylinder 5, so I'll correct these as I go. But here's my measurements. Quarter thou over at the top, half a thou mid, under 60, you know, a little bigger than half a thou. It's 60.0006 bigger, and then here's 90 degrees. So the mid and the bottom measured exactly the same. The top was a little different, like I'm a quarter thousandth over, and then I was a quarter thousandth under from a 90 degree. Now, I will say I don't have any marks down inside here, like as far as the depth. I'm just eyeballing it, so that potentially could be, you know, part of the problem, like as far as having maybe somewhat of a difference in measurement, but it's going to be really close. I'm just kind of doing this for peace of mind, even though if my measurements aren't, you know, within 1,000th exactly the same depth of each other. Like, I don't think it's going to be some drastic difference. As long as the numbers look, they're within spec, like, then I'm happy with it. Which I'm assuming everything is. But I'm measuring everything for peace of mind. I'm not, I guess, being that critical about it. If something is more than 1,000th off, you know, cylinder to cylinder, or as I do a measurement and then 90 degrees from that, about the same area. Like if something's 1,000 or more over, or 2,000ths over in difference, like, then that's more concerning. So I'm about to do a hyperlapse now. I'm gonna go ahead and measure the rest of them, but that's basically the gist of how you will measure your bores of a cylinder block. So all right, so I just finished 5, 6, 7, 8. I got the block turned to the 1, 2, 3, 4 side. I just cleaned all the bores, so I'm gonna do another hyperlapse. Go ahead and knock out the passenger side of the block. All right, don't mind my crookedness, and I wrote down some numbers in the wrong spot. I had to double check, but here's all my numbers. All the sets on the right is when I went to 90 degrees from the initial measurements. So I guess now I can I'm gonna take my rods, take my rod vise adapter I bought, I'll put it in my vise, I'll clamp the rods down, and I'm going to go and start torquing all my rod bolts to and measure stretch. All right, so I'm going to start measuring rod bolt stretch. So here's a rod bolt stretch gauge. Got 2 bolts out of one of the rod caps, and here are the instructions. These are ARP. I'll show you. Yeah, ARP 2000. They're 7/16 bolts. So instructions show 7/16 ARP 2000s need to be 0053 to 0057 inches of stretch, and you'd start off with 30 foot-pounds and then plus 42 degrees. And I'm using a snap-on torque wrench that does degreeing also. So I'll set you guys up. These threads already have some lube on there, so I'm going to add just a little bit of lube under the heads. That's what the instructions say to do. And I'll tighten, or I'm not tighten. I'm going to measure. I'll do one real quick. One of the bolts should be, I'm going to do it this way, and we'll zero. I'm going to zero, so I got the bolt sitting in there. We'll zero this to a relaxed bolt. And I'll lock this down, take the bolt back out. So now our gauge is zeroed to a relaxed bolt. This is the lube that came with the rods. So this is what I'm going to do. I need to cut. Be right back. I got to cut the tip off. All right. So I got my lube ready. I need to cut a bigger hole. Throw a little bit under the head of the bolt. So I'm going to set these so the bolts are like hand tight right now. I can set this down. So I'm going to go ahead and set this to 42 degrees. And 30 foot-pounds. So 30 foot-pounds. And also, whenever you're tightening, when you're doing the degreeing part, it needs to all be in one fluid motion. Like, you don't want to have to do it in stages. So make sure you're going to have enough room to be able to do that. End up being like 72 foot-pounds is what it equates to. So, alright, so everything's torqued. Pull the rod back out. So now we'll put her in here. So camera angles always kind of make things look different, but this is like, it is right under the 5, you know, like 49, I'd say. So according to this, we need to be 53 to 57. 53 to 57. So the very next mark would be 55. So we're like 4/10 shy. So the instructions cover that too. So it says, check your stretch. If you come up short from the stretch, use the following method to obtain. So you back the bolt off, relube, you retorque it, then you add 2 degrees of angle to the spec. So instead of 42 degrees, you go to 44 degrees, and then I would recheck it. .30 foot-pounds. I'm going to go to 44 degrees. Again, one fluid movement. Okay, so one thing I've noticed, double check that you're measuring every single rod bolt, because they're not all exactly the same. So I'm going to do a little system where I'm marking one with a Sharpie and one without, because I measured these 2 bolts separately, and the non-Sharpie marked one is actually 1/2 thousandth over. So I'm not going to recalibrate this every single time. So what I'm going to do is just mark one with the Sharpie, measure that one, and then measure the other one, and whatever the difference is, I'm going to write it down on my notes. And then whenever I take my final readings, just make sure to add 1/2 thousandth or whatever that difference was every single time you actually are measuring your stuff. So I'm zeroed to the Sharpie bolt, we'll call it. And this one is 4/10 higher, bigger. Torque bolt 30 foot-pounds. That one ended up 82.9. Rod out. So since we zeroed on the Sharpie side, we'll measure the Sharpie side first. And we're like right at 5.7, which is the top of the spec. It's 5.3 to 5.7, so we're good there. This one, hard to see, it's right, it's like 6.1. Barely see it, but we're 4/10 over, right? So we subtract 4/10, which 6.1 minus 4/10 would be 5.7. So they're exactly the same, the amount of stretch. You just can't go purely based on that, since you got to go off your real readings. So even though the rod bolts at their relaxed state are different, as long as you notate that, down here so you can see me, as long as you notate that difference, same amount of torque, 30 foot-pounds plus 47 degrees, which that's what I'm writing down, because rod number 2 was the same. So I'm writing 47 degrees. So until I get a change where I got to do a different amount of degree for a different bolt, I'll notate that too. But as of now, every bolt is taking the same amount of torque, 30 foot-pounds plus 47 degrees, to get it within spec. I'm like at the upper spec, so I might be able to drop to 46 degrees, and it might be within that, but I'm going to stay with 47 for now and keep rocking and rolling. But either way, I'm having to notate every initial measurement. So it's kind of annoying. What I had read that the ARP bolts usually are like really close, but apparently that's not the case for me in this situation. So now I'm gonna do a like a hyper flash style video, whatever, and I'm gonna finish doing all the rest of the rod bolts. Okay, and here's the final stuff. Everything 47 degrees, over 30 foot-pounds, all within spec. Here's all my notes. So I was anywhere from minus 1 thou and 2/10 all the way up to plus 2 thou and 4/10 was the the difference in the relaxed rod length. Like, so I would take the Sharpie marked bolt on the left side, I would zero my gauge to that one, and then I would measure the other one and then notate the difference. And then, but every single bolt torqued exactly the same, 30 foot-pounds plus 47 degrees, yielded, you know, or got them within spec. You know, you just have to account for that difference. So if you started off, you know, 2 thou over on the non-Sharpie marked bolt, then I would take that reading and subtract 2 thousandths from it, you know, and then see where it fell. So luckily, even though all the bolts weren't quote unquote perfect, they all torqued the same and yielded the same result, which is, in my opinion, that's more important. I would hate to have notes for, like, you know, the Sharpie or the non-Sharpie marked bolt for this number rod, this many degrees per that bolt. Like, that would have been really annoying to have different amount of degrees to get one specific bolt within spec. So I'm happy with it. Everything is taken. It ain't been crazy bad. I've spent, between doing the cylinder stuff, the pistons, and now doing the rod bolt stuff, it's been a few hours. But I think that'll be it for today's video. I covered a decent little amount. I got this is what I'm working on now. It's a guy's truck. I'm doing valve springs on it. So I'm gonna jump back on this. I've already done all the exhaust valves. I just need to go back and do all the intake valves now, the springs, and yeah, I think what's left for my stuff, I got 2 sets of bearings for the rods, standard and 1 thou over, same as I did for the crank. So I need to still measure the journals, the rod journals on the crank, and then I'll probably start with the plus thou bearings, torque down into the rods, and then it's this exact same process as doing your mains. You know, I'll take a micrometer, I'll measure the diameter of the rod journals on the crank, you know, for each cylinder, write that down, and then I'll put my bearings in the rods, torque the rod cap in my vise, and then I'll take a dial bore gauge, zeroed at whatever I choose to zero it to, you know, and then I'll take my readings, and then I'll know I might have to mix match bearing halves exactly the same way as I did my mains to get the amount of clearance I want. I'll probably shoot for like 1/2 thou larger of clearance than I was shooting for the mains. For the mains, I was 2 to 2.5 thousandths. For the rods, I'll be probably 2.5 to 3 thousandths. I believe is where it should fall. But again, I'm not 100%. We'll just have to start taking measurements and get everything torqued and measure the inner diameter after, you know, the bearings are in, and then I'll see where I'm at, right? So definitely very tedious. Throughout this process, I can see why when you buy a built short block or a built long block from a company that does all this, I can see why they charge what they charge now. You know, if it's done right, it is very tedious. It is time consuming. You know, I'm sure they're faster than me, of course, but still, nobody can haul ass through the process, I believe, and be accurate. You know what I mean? Like, if you're wanting to have a motor that's put together right, you know, and be within spec or be within the spec that builder is wanting, man, you got to take your time and you know, measure 3 times. You know what I mean? Just have everything right on the money. So, but I'm excited. It's good to get a little bit of work done. I'm always working on customers' vehicles, so my stuff's always kind of on the back burner. My truck's driving, so I mean, just there's no Whipple on it right now, but I mean, I can still use it. It's my family vehicle. But yeah, as soon as I get all this stuff done, I'll be happy to put the short block in the truck, swap the heads over. But yeah, next video we'll do the rod journals on the crank, take those measurements, and then we'll measure the inner diameter of the rod itself with the bearings in them, and see what we're working with and go from there. And then I'll do the thrust. I'll be able to install the crank, do the thrust, get all that right, and once the crank is set, then I can install the rods. Well, I keep getting ahead of myself. I still have to put the rings in, and I'll have to file piston rings, and well, that'll be another video of just doing the piston rings, and I'm doing it manually by hand. I didn't want to spend the money on doing the like that little electric one, the powered one. I'm sure it's way nicer, but I don't do enough of this to justify what that machine costs, so I bought a little hand crank filer from Summit. But yeah, and I got a piston ring squaring tool, so whenever I set a ring in the bore, the cylinder board, you know what I mean, it'll be squared, so every measurement will be the same as far as where I'm taking these measurements from, like the depth of that ring. But yeah, hope you guys are enjoying this. Hopefully somebody's learning something. You know, again, I'm not the end all be all by any means of building a motor, but as far as I know, I'm doing pretty good. So if anybody has any tips or tricks or suggestions, please comment down below, and it'll help me out and help out anybody else watching this video. But yeah, until next time, guys, peace.